The September sun was beginning to set over the hills of San Francisco, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected off the windows of the financial district's skyscrapers. But in the North Beach neighborhood, where narrow streets wound between red brick buildings and traditional Italian restaurants, the atmosphere was quite different. There, among the aroma of garlic and basil escaping from kitchens, something heavier hung in the air: fear. Vincent "Vinny" Torino adjusted the cuffs of his Italian shirt under his dark gray cashmere blazer as he walked down Columbus Avenue. At 42 years old, he commanded one of the most respected and feared families on the West Coast. His black hair, always perfectly slicked back with pomade, was beginning to show gray strands at the temples, which only enhanced his aura of authority. His dark eyes, almost black, had the ability to make grown men tremble with a simple look. "Good afternoon, Mr. Torino," murmured the owner of Chino's Bakery, bowing his head respectfully as Vincent passed by the storefront. The 60-year-old man, who had immigrated from Sicily in the 80s, knew well the unwritten rules of the neighborhood. Respect was legal tender, and Vincent Torino was the central bank. Two burly men followed Vincent at a respectful distance. Tony "Iron Hands" Benedetto, a 6'3" giant with hands the size of tennis rackets, and Sal Marconi, shorter but equally intimidating, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a reminder of an unsuccessful negotiation in the 90s. Vincent's destination that afternoon was Bella Vista, a restaurant that had become his unofficial headquarters. Located on a strategic corner, the establishment offered views of 3 different streets, a tactical advantage Vincent appreciated. The owner, Giuseppe Marcelli, a 70-year-old man with a graying mustache and hands always dirty with flour, owed his prosperity to Vincent's protection. "Giuseppe!" Vincent called as he entered the restaurant, his voice echoing off the walls decorated with black and white photographs of 1950s Italy. "How's business?" "Excellent, Mr. Torino, thanks to you," replied Giuseppe, wiping his hands on his apron stained with tomato sauce. "Your usual table is ready." Vincent's table was at the back of the restaurant, positioned so he could see both the main entrance and the back door. It was a round, dark mahogany table, always covered with an impeccable white linen tablecloth and decorated with a small red candle in the center. The surrounding chairs were brown leather, comfortable enough for long business meetings. As he settled in, Vincent observed the restaurant's activity. It was Thursday, and Bella Vista was moderately busy. Middle-aged couples savored pasta dishes, businessmen discussed contracts in low voices, and tourists took photos of the colorful plates. Everyone seemed relaxed, but Vincent noticed how conversations diminished in volume when he passed, how waiters avoided direct eye contact, how even children seemed instinctively quieter in his presence. "Mr. Torino," approached Marco, the restaurant's head waiter for 15 years. He was a thin man in his early 40s, always impeccably dressed in a white shirt and black tie. "What would you like to drink today?" "The usual, Marco. And bring that red wine that arrived from Tuscany last week." "Immediately, sir." Vincent pulled his phone from his blazer's inner pocket, a gold iPhone with an Italian leather case, and checked his messages. 3 collectors reported successes on their routes. 2 lawyers confirmed meetings for the following week, and his personal accountant informed him about bank transfers to Cayman Islands accounts. Everything functioned like Swiss clockwork in his empire. Tony and Sal positioned themselves at nearby tables, pretending to read newspapers while keeping their eyes alert for any suspicious movement. It was a well-rehearsed choreography, repeated hundreds of times over the years. "Vinny!" a familiar voice echoed through the restaurant entrance. Vincent looked up and saw Frank Castellano approaching, a wide smile on his tanned face. Frank was his right-hand man, a trusted man he'd known since their teenage days on North Beach streets. At 40, Frank maintained the physique of his amateur boxing days, with broad shoulders and fists that had resolved countless disputes. "Frank, sit down." Vincent gestured to the chair on his right. "How was the meeting with the Kowalskis?" Frank settled in, adjusting his navy blue tie. "They accepted our terms. 20% of everything that passes through the port, plus $5,000 a month fixed fee. No discussion. Excellent. And the Irish from Mission District? Still resisting, but not for much longer. Mickey O'Sullivan is starting to understand that cooperation is better than confrontation. Vincent nodded, satisfied. His territory extended across much of San Francisco, from the docks to the residential hills. It wasn't just about money, although the profits were substantial, but about respect, tradition, and order. In an increasingly chaotic world, Vincent offered stability, predictability. Of course, this stability had a price, but his clients always seemed willing to pay it. Marco returned with a bottle of Chianti Classico and 2 crystal glasses. He served the wine with precise movements, like a sacred ritual. Vincent tasted it, approving with a nod. "Mr. Torino," Giuseppe approached, his hands nervously intertwined. "I need to speak with you about a delicate matter." Vincent gestured for the man to come closer. Giuseppe looked around nervously before leaning over the table. "It's about the new waitress I hired yesterday. She's not from here. Came from somewhere in the interior, doesn't know our traditions." "And what's the problem, Giuseppe?" "She asked some questions about you. Wanted to know why everyone gets quiet when you arrive, why the other employees seem nervous. I tried to explain that you're a respected man, but she seemed skeptical." Frank and Vincent exchanged glances. It was rare for someone to question the established order, especially someone new to the neighborhood. "What's her name?" asked Vincent, his voice maintaining the calm tone he always used before making important decisions. Emma Sullivan. She's about 25. Came from somewhere in interior California. Said she's saving money for college." Vincent took a sip of wine, savoring the full-bodied liquid while processing the information. In his 25 years commanding the family, he had dealt with all types of people, from corrupt politicians to cops too honest for their own good. Most learned quickly how things worked in his territory. Those who didn't learn, well, they usually changed their minds or changed cities. "Where is she working today?" asked Vincent. "Night shift. Started an hour ago." Vincent looked at the Rolex on his wrist, a gift he had given himself when he took control of the family. It was 7:15 in the evening. "Giuseppe, don't worry. I'll talk to her personally. I'm sure it's just a matter of proper guidance." Giuseppe's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Torino. You always know how to resolve things." As Giuseppe walked away, Frank leaned closer to Vincent. "Want me to handle this? Sometimes an informal conversation works better." Vincent shook his head. "No, Frank. This requires a more personal touch. Besides, it's been a while since I've had the opportunity to educate someone about how things work here." Actually, Vincent was curious. There was something intriguing about someone who arrived in his territory and immediately started asking questions. Most people picked up on social nuances instinctively. The silent respect, the respectful greetings, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. This Emma Sullivan was either very naive or very brave. In either case, it would be interesting to meet her. Dinner proceeded normally. Vincent savored a plate of osso buco with saffron risotto while discussing with Frank the details of a new loan operation they planned to expand to the Richmond district. Tony and Sal remained in their positions, occasionally exchanging glances with other Vincent's men who entered and left the restaurant. Around 9 at night, the crowd began to thin. Families with children had already left, leaving mainly young couples and groups of friends extending the night with wine and desserts. It was the perfect time for Vincent to make his educational appearance. "Marco," called Vincent, making a discreet gesture. "Yes, Mr. Torino. Send the new waitress here. I want to meet her." Marco nodded and quickly headed to the kitchen. Vincent adjusted his tie and checked that there were no crumbs on his blazer. First impressions were important, especially when it came to establishing hierarchies. A few minutes later, Marco returned, accompanied by a young woman who immediately caught Vincent's attention. Emma Sullivan was different from what he had imagined. She was about 5'5", with light brown hair tied in a practical ponytail, and green eyes that seemed to assess everything around her with sharp intelligence. She wore the restaurant's standard uniform, white blouse, black skirt to the knee, and apron. But there was something in her posture that suggested confidence. not submission. "Mr. Torino," said Marco nervously. "This is Emma Sullivan, our new waitress." Emma approached the table without hesitation, maintaining direct eye contact with Vincent, something most people avoided doing. There was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Giuseppe said you wanted to meet me." Vincent studied her for a moment, noting how she didn't lower her eyes, how her hands didn't tremble, how she seemed completely at ease despite the palpable tension that had settled in the restaurant. Even conversations at other tables had diminished in volume, as if everyone was instinctively aware that something important was happening. "Sit down, Emma," said Vincent, gesturing to the chair on his left. "I'd like to talk with you." Emma looked at the chair, then back at Vincent. For a moment he thought she might refuse, which would be a first in his experience. But then she pulled the chair and sat down, keeping her back straight and hands crossed on the table. "Giuseppe told me you're new in the city," began Vincent, his voice taking on the paternal tone he usually used when he wanted to appear benevolent. "Where did you come from?" "Modesto," replied Emma. "Small town in the Central Valley. Very different from here." "I imagine so. San Francisco can be intimidating for someone not used to urban life. There are certain social nuances that might not be obvious to an outsider." Emma tilted her head slightly, as if genuinely interested in what he had to say. "What kind of nuances?" Vincent took a sip of wine, savoring both the liquid and the moment. It was rare to have the opportunity to personally explain how things worked in his world. "Well, Emma, North Beach is a neighborhood with a rich Italian history. Many of the families here have roots dating back to the early 20th century. There are traditions, hierarchies, specific ways of showing respect. It's important to understand these dynamics to properly integrate into the community." "I understand," said Emma, nodding thoughtfully. "And you're an important figure in these traditions?" The question was asked with such innocence that Vincent almost smiled. "Almost? You could say that, yes. My family has been influential in this area for many decades. We help maintain order, resolve disputes, ensure that businesses run smoothly. It's a role I take very seriously." "How interesting," said Emma, and Vincent detected a note of something in her voice that he couldn't immediately identify. "And how exactly do you help maintain order?" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Tony and Sal exchanged glances. Even Marco, who was polishing glasses near the bar, seemed to tense up. Nobody asked that kind of direct question to Vincent Torino, but Vincent maintained his composure. Maybe the girl was just naive. Maybe she needed a more clear explanation. "Well, Emma," he said, leaning slightly forward, "sometimes people have problems that the traditional legal system can't adequately resolve. Business disputes, territorial issues, family problems. In those cases, they turn to someone with experience and resources to find practical solutions." "Ah," said Emma, nodding as if she finally understood. "You're like a mediator. How noble." Vincent blinked. Noble? In all his years, nobody had described his work as noble. Respected, feared, necessary. Yes, but noble? It's one way to see it, he said, slightly disconcerted. Emma smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. "It must be very gratifying to help people that way. I bet you have many interesting stories." Vincent found himself momentarily speechless. There was something about the way she spoke, as if she were genuinely interested in his life, that was disconcerting. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Emma seemed simply curious. "Yes," he said finally, "I have some stories." "I'd love to hear them someday," said Emma, standing up from the chair. "But now I need to get back to work. Giuseppe doesn't like it when we keep customers waiting too long." She made a small bow, not the kind of submissive bow Vincent was used to receiving, but something more like a respectful greeting between equals. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Torino. I hope we can talk again soon." And with that, she walked away, returning to her tables as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Vincent watched her move through the restaurant, greeting customers, taking orders, genuinely smiling at everyone. There was something about her that was different. Not just her lack of fear, but the way she had treated him, like a normal person, not like the feared mob boss Vincent Torino. "Boss," said Frank in a low voice. "She didn't understand anything you said, did she?" Vincent took another sip of wine, his eyes still following Emma as she worked. "No, Frank, I think she understood perfectly." And for the first time in many years, Vincent Torino wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The next morning, Vincent woke up in his Russian Hill penthouse with a strange feeling in his chest. Through the panoramic windows, San Francisco Bay stretched like a blue-gray carpet, dotted with white sailboats and cargo ships that looked like toys in the distance. Normally, this view calmed him, reminding him of everything he had achieved. But today, his mind was occupied with thoughts about a brown-haired, green-eyed waitress who had called him noble. Vincent got up from the king-size bed with Italian silk sheets and walked to the gourmet kitchen, where his housekeeper, Senora Martinez, had already prepared his morning espresso and left the San Francisco Chronicle carefully folded next to the porcelain cup. "Good morning, Mr. Torino," she said in her English heavy with Mexican accent. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, thank you, Carmen," lied Vincent, taking a sip of the strong coffee. Actually, he had spent most of the night thinking about the conversation with Emma Sullivan, trying to understand why she had affected him so much. At 10 in the morning, Vincent was already dressed in a navy blue Armani suit and driving his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class through San Francisco's steep streets. He had meetings scheduled throughout the day, first with his lawyer to discuss some legitimate real estate investments, then with those responsible for his sports betting operations, and finally with a local politician who needed guidance about certain zoning decisions. But around 6 in the evening, Vincent found himself driving toward North Beach, specifically to Columbus Avenue. He told himself it was just to check how business was at Bella Vista, but deep down, he knew he was curious to see Emma Sullivan again. The restaurant was busy when he arrived. It was Friday, and the aroma of sautéed garlic and red wine created a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted with the cold autumn breeze blowing from the Pacific. Giuseppe greeted him at the entrance with his usual mixture of joy and nervousness. "Mr. Torino, what a pleasure to see you again so early. Your table is ready." Vincent nodded and headed to his usual table, immediately noticing that Emma was working. She wore the same uniform from the night before, but there was something different in her posture, more confident, as if she had quickly adapted to the restaurant's rhythm. She was serving a table of German tourists, patiently explaining the ingredients of each dish in clear, measured English. "Good afternoon, Mr. Torino," said Marco, appearing beside the table with the speed of someone who had perfected the art of anticipating important customers' needs. "The usual?" "Yes, Marco. And when Emma is free, ask her to come here. I want to make a special order." Marco nodded and quickly walked away. Vincent watched Emma finish serving the Germans, carefully note their order and head to the kitchen. There was a natural efficiency in her movements, as if she had been born for waitressing. Or maybe she was just good at adapting to new situations. 15 minutes later, Emma approached his table carrying a tray with his usual Chianti and a plate of antipasti. She placed everything on the table with precise movements, then looked directly at him with that same genuine smile from the night before. "Good afternoon, Mr. Torino. Marco said you wanted to make a special order." Vincent gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit for a moment, Emma. I want to know how you're adapting to the job." Emma looked around the restaurant, checking her other tables. "Well, I have some customers waiting, but I can stay a few minutes." She sat down, but Vincent noticed she maintained an alert posture, as if ready to get up at any moment. It was a professional attitude he respected, even though it was unusual for someone to prioritize other customers when he was speaking. "How are you liking San Francisco?" asked Vincent, taking a sip of wine. "It's fascinating," replied Emma, her eyes lighting up. "So different from Modesto. There, everyone knows everyone, and things never change much. Here, it seems like there's a different story on every corner." "And what brought you here?" "Giuseppe mentioned something about college." Emma nodded. "I want to study psychology at UC Berkeley. I'm saving money for tuition and housing. Modesto doesn't offer many opportunities for someone like me. Psychology, repeated Vincent, intrigued. Interesting choice. What attracts you to that field? I've always been curious about why people do the things they do, said Emma, leaning slightly forward. How their experiences shape their decisions, how they build their identities, how they interact in social groups. It's fascinating. Vincent almost choked on his wine. There was something deeply ironic about a future psychologist analyzing him without knowing who he really was. And you, continued Emma, what led you to become a mediator? The question caught him off guard again. Nobody had ever asked about his motivations, about how he had gotten to where he was. People simply accepted his position as a fact of life. Well, said Vincent, choosing his words carefully, I grew up in this neighborhood. My father was also involved in the community. I learned early that sometimes it's necessary to make difficult decisions to protect the people you love. It must have been a great responsibility for someone young, said Emma, and there was genuine compassion in her voice. Taking on the family work like that. Vincent studied her for a moment. There was something in her way of speaking that suggested she understood more than she let on. But at the same time, she seemed completely sincere. It was, he admitted. It's not always easy being responsible for so many people's well-being. I imagine not, said Emma. It must be lonely sometimes, having to make decisions that affect others' lives. People probably see you more as an authority figure than as a person. The observation hit Vincent like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly how he felt most days, isolated by his own position, surrounded by people who respected or feared him, but rarely saw him as a common human being. You're very perceptive, he said, his voice lower than intended. Emma smiled. It comes with the territory. When you grow up in a small town, you learn to read people. And when you want to study psychology, you pay attention to how people behave. At that moment, one of Emma's customers waved at her from a nearby table. She looked in their direction, then back at Vincent. I need to serve that table, but I really enjoyed our conversation, she said, standing up. You're much more interesting than I imagined. How so? Asked Vincent, genuinely curious. Emma hesitated for a moment as if deciding whether she should be honest. Well, when Giuseppe told me there was an important man I should meet, I expected someone different, more arrogant perhaps, less willing to have a real conversation. And what do you think now? I think you're someone who carries a lot of weight on your shoulders, said Emma, tilting her head slightly, and that maybe you don't have many people you can simply talk to. With that, she walked away to serve her other customers, leaving Vincent alone with his thoughts and a strange feeling that he had been seen, really seen, for the first time in years. During the next hour, Vincent watched Emma work. She treated all customers with the same respectful attention she had shown him, not because they were important or dangerous, but simply because they were people. She laughed genuinely at tourists' bad jokes, listened patiently to difficult customers' complaints, and even helped a small child who had spilled their juice cup. Around 8 at night, Frank arrived for his weekly meeting. He sat in the usual chair, but Vincent noticed how his eyes followed Emma as she moved through the restaurant. She's still here, observed Frank, his voice loaded with disapproval. I thought you were going to clarify things last night. I did clarify, said Vincent. We had a very educational conversation. And Vincent took a sip of wine, considering how to explain. She understood perfectly who I am, Frank. She just doesn't seem to care. Frank frowned. What do you mean, doesn't care? She treats me like a normal person, not like Vincent Torino, family boss. Just like Vincent, a man who works in the neighborhood. Boss? Said Frank, his voice taking on a warning tone. This could be dangerous. If she doesn't understand the hierarchy, it could cause problems. People might start thinking we're getting weak. Vincent knew Frank was right. His authority depended on respect, and respect depended on a certain distance, on recognition of his special position in the neighborhood's social order. If Emma continued to treat him as an equal, others might start questioning why they couldn't do the same. But there was something about the way Emma saw him that was liberating. When he was with her, he didn't need to be the feared Vincent Torino. He could simply be a 42-year-old man who liked red wine and interesting conversations. "I'll handle this, Frank," said Vincent finally. "My way." Frank didn't seem convinced but nodded. They spent the next hour discussing business, a new money laundering operation through a chain of laundromats, problems with a rival trying to expand into their territory, and details of a high-value loan to a desperate businessman. When Frank left, around 9:30, the restaurant was beginning to empty. Vincent remained at his table, savoring the last sip of wine and watching Emma clean the empty tables. There was something hypnotic about her efficient movements, the way she folded tablecloths and organized chairs. "Mr. Torino," Giuseppe approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "We're closing soon. Is there anything else I can do for you?" "Actually, yes," said Vincent, an idea forming in his mind. "I want to talk to Emma again before I leave." Giuseppe nodded and went to get the waitress. Emma approached a few minutes later, looking slightly tired but still smiling. "How can I help you, Mr. Torino?" "Sit down," said Vincent. "I want to make a proposal." Emma sat down, curious. "What kind of proposal?" "You mentioned you're saving money for college. How much do you make here per week?" Emma hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Well, with tips, about $400. Vincent nodded. It was a decent salary for a waitress, but not much for someone trying to save for Berkeley. "What if I offered you $500 per week, plus benefits?" Emma's eyes widened. "To do what?" "Continue doing exactly what you're doing. Be a waitress here at Bella Vista. The only difference is you'd be my personal waitress. You'd serve my table whenever I'm here, make sure everything is perfect." Emma studied him for a long moment, and Vincent could almost see the thoughts moving behind those intelligent green eyes. "Why?" she asked finally. The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He could say it was because she was efficient, professional, that he liked the quality of her service. But the truth was more complicated. "Because," he said slowly, "you're the first person in a long time who treats me like a normal human being, and I value that." Emma was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then to Vincent's surprise, she smiled. Not the professional smile she used with customers, but something warmer, more genuine. "Mr. Torino," she said, "can I make a counter-offer?" Vincent blinked. Nobody made counter-offers to him. "I'm listening." "I accept your $500 per week, but with one condition. When we're talking, you call me Emma, and I call you Vincent. No titles, no formalities. Just two people having a conversation." Vincent studied her, looking for signs of disrespect or manipulation. But all he saw was honesty, a genuine offer of friendship. When was the last time someone had offered friendship to Vincent Torino? Not out of fear or interest, but simply because they liked his company. "We have a deal," he said, extending his hand. Emma shook his hand, and Vincent noticed how she didn't hesitate, showed no nervousness. It was just a handshake between equals. "Great," she said, standing up. "So, Vincent, see you tomorrow." "Yes," said Vincent, and for the first time in years, he was genuinely looking forward to the next day. "See you tomorrow, Emma." As he drove home through San Francisco's illuminated streets, Vincent reflected on what had just happened. He had just paid $500 a week for the privilege of being treated like a normal person. And strangely, it seemed like the best deal he had made in a long time. But in the back of his mind, a small warning voice whispered that he was stepping into dangerous territory. In his world, closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability could be fatal. For now, however, Vincent chose to ignore that voice. For the first time in decades, he was looking forward to simply talking to someone. 3 weeks had passed since Vincent had made his agreement with Emma, and the routine at Bella Vista had changed in subtle but significant ways. Every night, around 6, Vincent arrived at the restaurant and headed to his usual table. Emma greeted him with a genuine smile and a "Good evening, Vincent" that sounded natural, as if they were old friends meeting for dinner. The conversations between them had evolved beyond superficial courtesies. Emma talked about her preparatory studies for Berkeley, about the psychology books she read in her spare time, about her family in Modesto, parents who worked on an almond farm and had saved every penny to give her the opportunity to study. Vincent, in turn, found himself sharing memories of his childhood in North Beach, stories about his grandfather who had immigrated from Sicily in the 1920s, and even his frustrations with the responsibilities he had inherited. That Tuesday in October, autumn had arrived in full force in San Francisco. The cold wind from the Pacific swept the streets, making the golden leaves of the plane trees dance in small whirlwinds. Vincent arrived at Bella Vista wearing a gray wool overcoat over his usual suit, his hair slightly disheveled by the wind. "Cold night out there," commented Emma, approaching with her tray and her usual smile. She had learned to anticipate his preferences. Chianti Classico, olive and cheese antipasti, and always an extra small candle on the table, because he liked the more intimate atmosphere. "Very cold," agreed Vincent, watching her serve the wine with precise movements. "How was your day?" "Interesting," said Emma, sitting in the chair that had officially become hers. "I had an interview at UC Berkeley this morning for a partial scholarship." Vincent raised his eyebrows. "How did it go?" "Well, I think they asked many questions about my life experience, about how growing up in a small town gave me perspective on social dynamics." Emma paused, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "I mentioned that I've learned a lot about complex social hierarchies working here in North Beach." "I hope you didn't go into details," said Vincent, but there was humor in his voice. "Of course not. I just said I work at a restaurant frequented by influential figures in the Italian community." Emma took a sip of the water she always ordered when sitting with him. "They were impressed with my ability to navigate different social contexts." Vincent laughed, a genuine sound that rarely escaped him in public. "Well, you certainly have a talent for that." What Vincent didn't know was that 3 tables behind him, Salvatore Sal Marconi was watching the interaction with growing discomfort. Sal had been loyal to the Torino family for 15 years, since Vincent had saved his life during a territorial war with the Russians in 2008. He respected his boss above all else, but what he was seeing in recent weeks worried him deeply. Sal watched Vincent laugh again at something Emma had said, noticed how the boss seemed relaxed, almost vulnerable. In 15 years, Sal had never seen Vincent lower his guard this way, especially not in public, and definitely not with a stranger. When Emma got up to serve other customers, Sal approached Vincent's table. He was a 45-year-old man with broad shoulders and calloused hands from his days working the docks before joining the organization. His loyalty was unquestionable, but so was his concern for Vincent's safety. "Boss," said Sal, keeping his voice low, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Vincent gestured to the chair Emma had left vacant. "Sure, Sal. What's bothering you?" Sal looked around nervously before leaning forward. "It's about the waitress, boss." "Emma. What about her?" "Well," Sal hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The boys are starting to talk about how we two what, Sal? How she doesn't show proper respect, how she treats you like you're anyone, and how you seem to like it." Vincent felt a familiar coldness settling in his chest, the same coldness that preceded difficult decisions. "Continue." "Boss, you know I respect you more than anything, but some of the boys are wondering if she's not having a bad influence on you, if she's not making you go soft." The word soft hung in the air between them like an accusation. In Vincent's world, being perceived as weak was a death sentence. Weak leaders were replaced, and replacement was rarely peaceful. "Who's talking, Sal?" "Tony mentioned some things, and that new kid, Marco Benedetti, he made some comments about how things were different in the old days when your father was in command." Vincent knew Marco Benedetti, Tony's nephew, a 28-year-old too ambitious for his own good, the type of person who saw changes as opportunities to advance in the hierarchy. "And what exactly are they saying?" Sal swallowed hard. "That you're spending too much time with a stranger, that you're sharing information you shouldn't, that you're falling in love." The last word hit Vincent like a slap. Falling in love? The idea was absurd. Emma was a friend, maybe the first real friend he'd had in decades, but just that. "Sal," said Vincent, his voice taking on the icy tone that everyone in his organization had learned to fear. "Do you think I'm falling in love with a waitress?" "No, boss, of course not. But that's how it looks to outsiders. And perception is reality in our business." Vincent knew Sal was right. In his world, the appearance of weakness was as dangerous as actual weakness. But the idea of cutting his friendship with Emma, of returning to the isolation that had been his life for so long, was almost unbearable. "Thank you for warning me, Sal," said Vincent finally. "I'll handle this." Sal nodded, clearly relieved to have fulfilled his duty. "You always know what to do, boss." After Sal walked away, Vincent was alone with his thoughts and a glass of wine that suddenly tasted bitter. He watched Emma working, noticing how she greeted each customer with genuine cordiality, how she seemed to find joy in the small human interactions that made up her day. Around 9 at night, when the restaurant's crowd had diminished, Emma returned to his table. But this time, Vincent noticed something different in her expression, a subtle concern she was trying to hide. "Everything okay?" he asked. Emma hesitated before sitting down. "Vincent, can I ask a personal question?" "Sure." "Do you have enemies?" The question caught him completely off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because," said Emma, looking directly into his eyes, "this afternoon, when I left the Berkeley interview, I noticed a man following me. Dark hair, black suit, driving a black Cadillac. He followed me here but didn't enter the restaurant." Vincent felt his blood freeze in his veins. Someone was watching Emma. Someone was sending a message. "Are you sure you were being followed?" "I am. In Modesto, you learn to notice when something's out of the ordinary. And a man in a suit driving a Cadillac is definitely out of the ordinary for my daily routine." Vincent pulled out his cell phone and quickly sent a text message to Frank. "Need you at Bella Vista, now." "Emma," he said, keeping his voice calm, "I want you to go home early today, and I want you to accept a ride." "Vincent, you're scaring me. What's happening?" Before Vincent could answer, Frank appeared at the restaurant entrance, his eyes immediately scanning the environment for threats. He quickly headed to Vincent's table. "Boss, got your message. What's the problem?" "Emma was being followed today. Man in black suit, black Cadillac." Frank frowned. "Don't recognize the description, not one of ours." "Exactly," said Vincent. "I want you to take Emma home, and I want surveillance on her apartment tonight." Emma looked between the two men, and Vincent could see understanding beginning to form in her eyes. "Vincent, who are you really?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Vincent looked at Frank, who was clearly waiting for instructions on how to handle the situation. He looked at Emma, whose green eyes were full of a mixture of fear and determination. For 3 weeks, he had lived a fantasy, the fantasy of being just Vincent, a man who liked red wine and interesting conversations. But fantasies always came to an end, and reality always collected its price. "Emma," he said slowly, "there are things about me you don't know, things that might be better not to know." "But I need to know, don't I?" she said, her voice firm despite the obvious fear. "Because someone followed me today, and you're reacting like it's a death threat." Vincent looked at her for a long moment, seeing not just the brave waitress who had become his friend, but also the future psychologist who knew how to ask the right questions. "Yes," he said finally, "you need to know." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, are you sure that—" "Frank," interrupted Vincent, "take Emma home. Make sure she gets there safely. And tomorrow morning, I want a meeting with all the captains. We have problems to solve." Emma stood up slowly, taking her purse and coat. "Vincent, whatever you are, whatever you do, does this change anything between us?" Vincent studied her, seeing the woman who had become the first person in decades to see him as a human being. "That depends on you, Emma." "Then no," she said, surprising him once again. "It doesn't change anything." As Frank escorted Emma out of the restaurant, Vincent remained at his table, finishing his wine and contemplating the consequences of allowing someone to get too close. In his world, closeness was dangerous, not just for him, but for anyone he cared about. But for the first time in his life, Vincent Torino was willing to take that risk. What he didn't know was that 3 blocks away, Marco Benedetti was on the phone with someone outside the family, someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to weaken Vincent's position. Yes, Marco was saying in a low voice. "He's definitely distracted. The waitress is clearly his weak point. If you want to make a move, now is the time." War was coming to North Beach, and Emma Sullivan had involuntarily become the center of it. The next morning, Vincent woke before dawn, with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. Through his penthouse windows, San Francisco still slept under a blanket of gray fog that stretched from the bay to the hills. But in his mind, the events of the previous night repeated like a looping film. Emma being followed, Sal's concerns about his weakness, and the growing certainty that his friendship with the waitress had put them both in danger. At 7 in the morning, Vincent was already dressed in a black Brioni suit and driving through the empty streets toward the family office, a discreet 3-story building on a North Beach side street, officially registered as Torino Import-Export Company. The building had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now served as command center for all family operations. Frank was already waiting in the 3rd-floor office when Vincent arrived. The room was decorated with dark mahogany furniture, black and white photographs of Sicily, and a large conference table where generations of Torinos had made decisions that shaped San Francisco's underworld. "Report," said Vincent, serving himself an espresso from the Italian machine he kept in the corner of the room. "Emma got home safely last night," said Frank, consulting a small notebook. "Apartment in Richmond District, 2nd floor of a 4-story building. Quiet neighborhood, mainly young families and students. I put 2 surveillance men. Discreet, she won't notice. And the black Cadillac? Nothing yet, but I have people checking all the car rental companies in the city. If someone rented a Cadillac in the last 48 hours, we'll find out." Vincent nodded, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "And the captains? Arriving now. Tony, Sal, and the others." "But Vincent," Frank hesitated. "Marco Benedetti asked to participate in the meeting. Said he has important information." Vincent felt a familiar coldness settling in his chest. Marco Benedetti, Tony's ambitious nephew, who had been questioning his leadership. The timing was too suspicious to be coincidence. "Let him come," said Vincent. "I want to hear what he has to say." During the next hour, the Torino family captains gathered in the conference room. Tony Iron Hands Benedetto, Sal Marconi, Frank Castellano, and 3 other men who had served the family for decades, and Marco Benedetti, the youngest of the group, with his 28 years and poorly disguised ambitions. "Gentlemen," began Vincent, taking his place at the head of the table, "we have a situation. Someone is watching people close to me. This represents a threat not only to my safety, but to the safety of the entire family." "Boss," said Tony, his voice hoarse from decades of smoking Cuban cigars, "do you have any idea who it might be?" "Not yet, but we're investigating." Vincent looked around the table, studying each face. "I want all of you to double security. No predictable routines, no meetings in usual places, and I want all our informants in other families to keep their ears open." Marco Benedetti shifted in his chair. "Boss, can I make an observation?" Vincent studied him. Marco was an attractive young man, with dark hair slicked back and expensive suits he couldn't really afford on his organization's salary. There was something in his eyes, a hungry ambition that Vincent recognized because he had seen it in the mirror when he was younger. "I'm listening, Marco." "Well, sir, maybe this threat isn't as mysterious as it seems. Maybe someone is trying to send a message about vulnerabilities in our leadership." The silence in the room became heavy. Frank leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Sal looked nervously between Vincent and Marco. Tony, Marco's uncle, seemed to want to disappear into his chair. "What kind of vulnerabilities, Marco?" asked Vincent, his voice dangerously calm. Marco swallowed hard, but continued. "Well, sir, we all know you've developed a friendship with a stranger, a waitress who doesn't understand our traditions, who doesn't show proper respect. Maybe someone sees this as an opportunity." Vincent stood up slowly, and everyone in the room could feel the change in atmosphere. It was as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. "Marco," said Vincent, walking slowly around the table, "are you suggesting that my friendship with Emma Sullivan is a weakness our enemies can exploit?" Well, sir, it's just an observation. "An interesting observation," said Vincent, stopping behind Marco's chair, "especially coming from someone who has been making his own observations about my leadership." Marco paled. "Sir, I would never question your leadership. I just—" "Frank," interrupted Vincent, "tell Marco about the phone call we intercepted last night." Frank smiled coldly. "Sure, boss." At 11:47 p.m., our monitoring equipment picked up a call from Marco's personal phone to a number registered under Dmitry Volkov's name. The name hung in the room like a bomb. Dmitry Volkov was the leader of the Russian Mafia in San Francisco, longtime rival of the Torino family. If Marco was talking to the Russians— "Marco," said Vincent, his voice now cold as Pacific wind, "would you like to explain why you were talking to our enemies?" Marco stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Boss, I can explain. They approached me. I didn't—" "Sit down," ordered Vincent, and the power in his voice made Marco obey immediately. "Now tell me exactly what you said to Volkov." Marco looked around the table, seeking support, but found only cold faces and accusing eyes. Even his Uncle Tony had distanced himself from him. They wanted information about your routines, about where you go, when you go. I said you had been spending a lot of time at Bella Vista, that you seemed distracted. And what did they offer in return? Money and a position in their organization when they took control. Vincent nodded slowly. "I see. So you not only betrayed your family, Marco, you're also stupid enough to believe the Russians would keep their promises." "Boss, please, I can make up for this. I can be a double agent, pass false information to them." Vincent looked at Frank, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. Traitors didn't become double agents. Traitors simply disappeared. "Marco," said Vincent, returning to his chair, "you made two fatal mistakes. First, you betrayed your family. Second, you put an innocent person in danger with your actions." "The waitress isn't innocent," exploded Marco. "She's corrupting you, making you forget who you are." Vincent stood up again, and this time there was something in his eyes that made everyone in the room instinctively step back. "Marco," he said, his voice low and deadly, "Emma Sullivan is more loyal to me in 3 weeks of friendship than you were in 3 years in the family. She treats me with genuine respect, not out of fear or greed. And you made her a target for your own pathetic ambition." Vincent gestured to Tony and Sal. "Take Marco to the basement. I'll deal with him personally later." As Marco was dragged from the room, screaming promises and pleas, Vincent turned to the remaining captains. "Gentlemen, now we know who our enemy is and how they got their information. The Russians are planning a move against us, and they think Emma is my weakness." Vincent paused, looking each man in the eyes. "They're right about one thing. I care about her. But they're wrong about this making me weak. It makes me dangerous." Frank smiled. "What do you want us to do, boss?" "First, I want Emma protected. 24-hour surveillance, but discreet. Second, I want you to spread the word that I'm furious about Marco's betrayal, and that anyone who questions my leadership will have the same fate. Third," Vincent paused, an idea forming in his mind. "Third, it's time for Emma to know the truth about who I am." "Boss," said Sal hesitantly, "are you sure that's wise?" "Sal, she's already involved. The Russians made her a target. She deserves to know why her life is in danger." Vincent looked out the window, where the sun had finally burned through the morning fog, revealing the city he had protected and controlled for more than 2 decades. "Besides," he continued, "if we're going to war with the Russians, I need all the allies I can get. And something tells me Emma Sullivan might be more valuable than any of us imagine." 2 hours later, Vincent was sitting in his Mercedes outside Emma's apartment building in Richmond District. He had spent the entire morning thinking about how to explain his true identity to a woman who had become important to him precisely because she didn't know who he was. At 2 in the afternoon, Emma left the building carrying a backpack full of books, probably going to the library to study for her preparatory exams. Vincent got out of the car and intercepted her on the sidewalk. "Vincent?" she said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Emma, about who I really am." Emma studied him for a moment, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the seriousness in his eyes. All right. My apartment or somewhere public. Your apartment. What I have to say isn't for strange ears. 15 minutes later, they were sitting in Emma's small living room, a cozy space decorated with secondhand furniture and photographs of her family in Modesto. Vincent felt strangely out of place in the domestic, normal environment, so different from the luxurious offices and expensive restaurants where he conducted his business. "Emma," he began, "remember when you asked me if I had enemies?" "Yes." "The answer is yes, many enemies, because I'm not just a mediator in the Italian community." Vincent paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm Vincent Torino, head of the Torino family, what you would probably call the Mafia." Emma was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Vincent expected shock, fear, maybe disgust. Instead, she nodded slowly. "That explains a lot," she said finally. "Explains what?" "Why everyone at the restaurant gets nervous when you arrive. Why Giuseppe acts like you're royalty. Why you always sit with your back to the wall with a view of all exits." Emma studied him. "And why you seemed so surprised when I treated you like a normal person." Vincent blinked. "You're not afraid. Should I be? Most people would be." Emma leaned forward, her green eyes serious. "Vincent, have you ever hurt me?" "No." "Have you ever threatened to hurt me?" "Never." "Have you ever been anything but respectful and kind to me?" "No, but Emma, you don't understand. I do things that aren't legal, things that hurt people." Emma nodded. "I figured. But the question is, do you do these things out of cruelty or necessity?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "In Modesto, I knew farmers who had to kill coyotes to protect their sheep. They didn't like doing it, but it was necessary. I knew fathers who had to use violence to protect their families from dangerous men. Violence didn't make them bad. Context mattered." Vincent studied her, impressed once again with her ability to see beyond surfaces. "Emma, yesterday you were followed because someone within my organization betrayed me. He told our enemies you were important to me, and now they think they can use you against me. And are they right? Am I important to you?" Vincent hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Yes. You're the first person in decades who sees me as Vincent, not as Boss Torino. That's important to me." Emma smiled, the same genuine smile that had won his friendship. "Then we have a problem to solve. We. Vincent, you may be the mob boss, but you're also my friend, and I don't abandon my friends when they're in trouble." Vincent felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had buried so long ago he almost didn't recognize it. Gratitude, genuine loyalty, maybe even, "Emma," he said, "this is going to be dangerous, very dangerous." "Then," she said, standing up and walking to the window, "we better start planning how to deal with it." Vincent watched her look out the window at the quiet Richmond District street, where children played in a nearby park and young couples walked their dogs. It was a world so different from his, a world of normalcy and innocence he had protected from afar for years. But now, for the first time, he had someone who knew both worlds and who chose to stand by his side anyway. "Emma," he said, "there's something else you need to know." "What?" "The man who betrayed me, he's dead. I killed him this morning." Emma turned from the window, and Vincent saw something in her eyes he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't fear, it wasn't disgust, it was understanding. "Did he put my life in danger?" she asked. "Yes." "And yours?" "Yes." "And would he have continued to do so if you hadn't stopped him?" "Yes." Emma nodded. "Then you did what you had to do to protect us." Vincent studied her, looking for signs of judgment or fear, but all he saw was the same woman who had become his friend, intelligent, brave, and apparently capable of accepting the moral complexities of his world. "Emma, he said, "are you sure you want to get involved in this?" "Vincent," she replied, "I'm already involved. The question is, are we going to face this together, or are you going to try to protect me by keeping distance?" Vincent thought about all the people he had lost over the years, friends who had died in territorial wars, family members who had distanced themselves out of fear, women who had fled when they discovered who he really was. But Emma Sullivan was offering something he had never had, a partnership based on complete knowledge and genuine acceptance. Together, he said finally, we'll face this together. Outside, in a black Cadillac parked 3 blocks away, Dmitry Volkov lowered his binoculars and smiled. The Italian mob boss had just entered his weaknesses apartment. It was time to send a message that Vincent Torino would never forget. The attack came 3 days later, on a rainy Thursday, that turned San Francisco's streets into black mirrors, reflecting the city's lights. Vincent was at Bella Vista as always, but this time the atmosphere was different. Emma worked normally, but Vincent could see the tension in her movements, the way she discreetly checked all the restaurant's entrances, as she had learned to do in recent days. Giuseppe had closed the restaurant early, at 9 at night, claiming plumbing problems. Actually, Vincent had requested privacy for a crucial meeting with the heads of the other Italian families in the city. If there was going to be war with the Russians, he needed allies. The round table at the back of Bella Vista now accommodated 5 men besides Vincent. Don Salvatore Benedetto, no relation to Tony, head of the South Bay family. Don Marco Rossi, who controlled operations in Oakland. Don Giuseppe Marcelli, responsible for Daly City territory, and 2 other minor bosses. These were men Vincent respected and who, in turn, recognized his authority as the most powerful among them. Emma served red wine and antipasti, moving silently among the men like an efficient shadow. Vincent had explained the situation to her. The Russians were planning a coordinated attack against all Italian families, using Vincent's supposed weakness as an entry point. It was a bold move that could change the balance of power in San Francisco forever. Vincent, said Don Salvatore, a 60-year-old man with completely white hair and penetrating blue eyes. Are you sure Volkov will attack tonight? I am, replied Vincent, taking a sip of Chianti. Our informants confirmed it. They plan to simultaneously hit Bella Vista, my office, and your territories. The idea is to catch us off guard and fragmented. Don Marco Rossi, a corpulent man with a scar cutting across his left cheek, slammed his fist on the table. These Russians think they can simply take what we've built for generations? They think we're weak, said Vincent, that our traditions have made us obsolete, that the new generation doesn't have the stomach to do what's necessary. Emma approached to serve more wine, and Vincent noticed how the other bosses watched her. There was curiosity in their eyes, but also respect. The story of how a waitress had won Vincent Torino's trust had already spread through San Francisco's Italian underworld. And what's your plan, Vincent? Asked Don Giuseppe Marcelli. Vincent looked at Emma, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They had discussed this for hours over the past 3 days, and she had contributed insights that none of his traditional advisors would have offered. We're going to give them exactly what they expect, said Vincent. A demonstration of weakness that will lure them into a trap. At 10:15 at night, Vincent was alone at Bella Vista, sitting at his usual table with only one candle lit, apparently vulnerable and unprotected. Emma had left work an hour earlier, but was actually hidden in the kitchen with a direct line to Frank, who was coordinating defenses outside. The plan was simple in its elegance. Allow the Russians to enter the restaurant, capture Vincent, and then discover they had fallen into a carefully orchestrated trap. But the riskiest part of the plan depended entirely on Emma. At 10:30, 3 men entered Bella Vista. Vincent recognized them immediately. Alexei Petrov, Volkov's right-hand man, Boris Kozlov, a professional assassin with more than 20 kills on his record, and Ivan Morozov, interrogation specialist. All wore dark suits and expressions Vincent had seen many times over the years, the cold confidence of predators who believed they had cornered their prey. Vincent Torino, said Alexei in English, heavy with Russian accent. What a pleasure to finally meet you personally. Vincent didn't stand up, just gestured to the empty chairs around the table. Gentlemen, please sit down. Can I offer wine? Boris laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. You're very calm for someone about to die. Die? Vincent took a sip of wine. How dramatic. I thought you wanted to talk business. Business is simple. said Alexei, sitting to Vincent's right. "You hand over your territories, your operations, and your men to Dmitry Volkov. In return, we allow you to live. And if I refuse," Ivan smiled, revealing gold teeth, "then your little waitress friend will discover what happens to people who get involved in matters they don't understand." Vincent felt the familiar coldness settling in his chest, but maintained a neutral expression. "Emma has nothing to do with this." "Ah, but she does," said Alexei. "She's your weakness, Vincent, and weaknesses must be eliminated." At that moment, as if summoned by fate itself, Emma appeared from the kitchen entrance, carrying a tray with coffee and desserts. "Sorry for the interruption," she said with a bright smile, "but I thought you gentlemen might like some tiramisu. It's the house specialty." The three Russians turned to look at her, and Vincent saw the surprise in their eyes. They expected to find a frightened waitress, maybe crying in Vincent's arms. Instead, they found a confident young woman greeting them as if they were normal customers. "You must be Emma," said Alexei, studying her with predatory interest. "We've heard a lot about you." "I hope good things," replied Emma, placing tiramisu plates in front of each man. "Are you friends of Vincent's?" Boris laughed again. "You could say that." Emma sat in the chair that had become hers, between Vincent and Alexei. How wonderful. Vincent has so many interesting friends. "Are you from the neighborhood?" "We're from out of town," said Ivan, clearly amused by her apparent naivety. "How exciting. From where?" "Russia," replied Alexei, deciding to play with what he saw as easy prey. "Russia!" exclaimed Emma, her eyes lighting up. "I've always wanted to visit Russia. It must be fascinating to grow up in such a different culture. I bet you have very interesting perspectives on how to resolve conflicts." Vincent watched the interaction with growing admiration. Emma was doing exactly what they had planned, presenting herself as a naive, curious psychology student, interested in understanding people's motivations. "Conflicts?" said Boris, leaning forward. "What kind of conflicts?" "Well," said Emma, taking a sip of water, "Vincent told me you're businessmen. I imagine you deal with many challenging situations. How do you decide what's the best approach for each situation?" Alexei exchanged glances with his companions. The girl was asking questions, but they seemed academic, not investigative. "It depends on the situation," said Alexei. "Sometimes diplomacy works. Other times, more direct methods are necessary." "Fascinating," said Emma, as if listening to a university lecture. "And how do you determine when diplomacy has failed? There must be specific signs that indicate when it's time to escalate the situation." Ivan smiled, clearly enjoying the attention. "When the other party shows weakness, when they become sentimental, when they start caring more about people than power." "Like Vincent cares about me?" asked Emma innocently. "Exactly," said Boris, slapping his hand on the table. "A strong leader can't afford to have personal weaknesses." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the logic, but can I make an observation?" "Sure," said Alexei, amused. "Well, I'm studying psychology, and one thing I've learned is that sometimes what seems like weakness on the surface can be disguised strength. For example, the ability to inspire genuine loyalty can be much more powerful than ruling only through fear." "Genuine loyalty?" Boris laughed. "There's no such thing in our world." "No?" Emma looked around the table. "Then why are you here? Why did you risk your lives coming to Vincent's territory to confront him personally? Surely it would be safer to simply eliminate him from a distance." The question caught the three Russians off guard. They exchanged glances, and Vincent could see the gears turning in their minds. "Because," said Alexei slowly, "we want him to hand over his operations voluntarily. It's more efficient." "Ah," said Emma, "but this isn't really about efficiency, is it? It's about humiliation. You want him to kneel publicly to admit you're superior. This is about ego, not business." Ivan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're very smart for a waitress." "Thank you," said Emma with a smile. "But here's the interesting thing about egos. They make people predictable, and predictable people make mistakes. At that moment, Alexei seemed to realize something was wrong. He looked around the empty restaurant, noticing for the first time how the curtains were closed, how there was no movement on the street outside. "Where is everyone?" he asked. "Who?" said Emma innocently. "The other customers, the staff." "Oh, Giuseppe closed early today. Plumbing problems." Emma took another sip of water. "Why do you ask?" Boris stood up abruptly, his hand moving to the gun under his jacket. "This is a trap." "Of course it is," said Emma, her voice losing all feigned naivety. "Did you really think you could enter Vincent's territory, threaten his life and mine, and simply walk away?" Alexei drew his gun, pointing it at Emma. "You little—" "I wouldn't do that," said Vincent calmly, and there was something in his voice that made Alexei hesitate. "Why?" "You're unarmed." "Alone." "No," said Emma, "he's not." At that moment, the restaurant lights came on fully, revealing Frank and Tony positioned at the exits, with guns pointed at the Russians. Sal emerged from the kitchen, and two other Vincent's men appeared from the shadows near the bar. "Gentlemen," said Vincent, standing up slowly, "allow me to properly introduce Emma Sullivan. She's not just a waitress. She's a future psychologist who spent the last 3 days studying psychological profiles of you three based on reports from our informants." Emma smiled, and this time there was something predatory in her expression. "Alexei Petrov, son of a Soviet military officer, always trying to prove he's tougher than his father. Boris Kozlov, orphan from Moscow's streets, uses violence to mask deep insecurity. Ivan Morozov, gambling addict who joined organized crime to pay debts, always looking for the next big score." The three Russians looked at her with a mixture of shock and anger. "You came here," continued Emma, "because Dmitry Volkov convinced you that Vincent was weak, that I was his weakness. But you didn't understand the real dynamic. Vincent isn't weak for caring about me. He's stronger because now he has someone who can see his enemies from a completely different perspective." "You little bitch!" hissed Boris, turning his gun toward her. "Boris," said Vincent, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "if you point that gun at her for one more second, I'll make you beg for death for a week before granting it." Boris hesitated, and in that hesitation, Frank moved. In seconds, the three Russians were disarmed and surrounded. "Now," said Vincent, walking around the table, "let's discuss the terms of your surrender. Emma, would you like to explain to them what happens next?" Emma stood up, adjusting her blouse as if preparing to give an academic presentation. "Well, gentlemen, based on my psychological analysis, I predict the following. Alexei will try to negotiate, offering information about Volkov in exchange for his life. Boris will try to fight to the end because he can't accept defeat. And Ivan," she looked at the gold-toothed man, "Ivan will try to make a deal to save his own skin, even if it means betraying his companions." "You're crazy if you think we'll—" began Boris. "I have information about Volkov," interrupted Alexei. "I can tell you where he is, what his plans are." Ivan looked nervously between his companions. I can help too. I know all his operations." Boris looked at his companions with contempt. "Cowards!" Emma looked at Vincent with a satisfied smile. "As I said, predictable." Vincent smiled back, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "Emma, you're absolutely brilliant." For the next 2 hours, Vincent and Emma worked together to extract information from the three Russians. Emma used psychological techniques to break down their defenses, while Vincent applied more traditional pressure. It was a devastatingly effective combination. At 2 a.m, they had everything: the location of Volkov's hideout, details of his financial operations, names of his corrupt contacts in the police, and even access codes for his offshore bank accounts. "Vincent," said Emma, as Frank and the others took the Russians away, "can I make one last observation?" "Sure." Volkov made the same mistake many powerful men make. He underestimated a woman because she didn't fit his traditional definition of threat. Vincent studied her, seeing not just the brave waitress who had become his friend, but also the formidable strategist she had revealed herself to be. "Emma," he said, "you didn't just save my life tonight, but probably the entire Italian power structure in San Francisco. "We saved it," she corrected. "It was teamwork." Vincent nodded but knew she was being modest. Emma Sullivan had done something none of his advisors or soldiers had managed. She had transformed his supposed weakness into his greatest strength. 3 days later, Dmitry Volkov was found dead in his office, apparently the victim of an accident with a bomb he was preparing himself. His operations were systematically dismantled. His men were absorbed by Italian families or simply disappeared. And at Bella Vista, Vincent Torino continued to dine every night, served by a waitress who had become much more than a friend. Emma Sullivan had become his partner, his advisor, and perhaps, though neither had the courage to admit it yet, something even more important. "You know," said Emma one night, while serving his usual Chianti, "I still think you're noble." "How so?" "You protect people. You maintain order. You care about your community." Emma smiled. "The fact that you do this outside the traditional legal system doesn't change your fundamental motivations." Vincent watched her walk away to serve other customers, and for the first time in his life, he felt he had found someone who saw him exactly as he was and accepted him completely. In Vincent Torino's world, that was rarer and more valuable than any treasure. And Emma Sullivan, the waitress from Modesto, who had made the feared mob boss look ridiculous by treating him like a normal human being, had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength doesn't come from inspiring fear, but from inspiring genuine loyalty. 6 months later, when Emma received her acceptance letter to Berkeley with a full scholarship, Vincent insisted on throwing a party at Bella Vista. And when she graduated in psychology, he already had plans to offer her a unique position in his organization, the first psychological advisor in the Italian Mafia. After all, as Emma had proven, understanding people was the most powerful weapon of all.